Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history of the American frontier. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The winter of 1854 in Vermilion County, Indiana, brought with it an oppressive silence that seemed to settle over the sprawling Harrow estate like a funeral shroud. The property, spanning nearly 3,000 acres of fertile farmland and dense woodlands along the Wabash River, had been the crown jewel of local landowner Elias Harrow's growing empire. To those who knew him only in passing, Harrow appeared to be nothing more than a successful businessman who had carved out his piece of the American dream through shrewd investments and careful cultivation of political connections. But beneath the veneer of respectability lay a web of secrets so dark and twisted that their eventual exposure would shake the foundations of the entire county. Elias Harrow was not a man who courted attention. At 47 years of age, he possessed the kind of unremarkable appearance that allowed him to move through social circles without leaving much impression beyond his obvious wealth. Medium in height and build, with prematurely graying hair and pale blue eyes that rarely seemed to focus directly on the person he was addressing, Harrow had mastered the art of being simultaneously present and invisible. Those who conducted business with him often remarked later that they could barely recall the details of his appearance, only the unsettling sense that he had been studying them far more intently than they had been studying him. The Harrow estate itself was an imposing testament to its owner's prosperity. The main house, a Greek Revival mansion constructed of locally quarried limestone, dominated a slight rise overlooking the river valley. With its towering columns and perfectly symmetrical facade, the structure projected an aura of classical authority that commanded respect from all who approached. But it was not the main house that would ultimately become the focus of investigation and speculation. Rather, it was the collection of smaller buildings scattered throughout the property, each serving purposes that Harrow kept deliberately obscure from his neighbors and even from most of his own household staff. The most peculiar of these structures was a long, low building constructed of the same limestone as the main house but lacking any of its architectural flourishes. Local workers who had been hired for its construction in 1851 referred to it privately as the warehouse, though no one could determine exactly what goods might require such extensive storage space. The building measured approximately 100 feet in length and 40 feet in width, with small, high windows that provided minimal natural light and massive wooden doors secured with an unusual number of iron locks. More intriguing still was the fact that the building appeared to have been designed with two distinct sections, separated by a thick interior wall that contained no visible doorway between the spaces. The eastern section of the building was occasionally visited by Harrow himself. All was alone, and all was during the hours between sunset and dawn. Several of the estate's workers reported seeing lamplight flickering through the high windows during these nocturnal visits, but none dared to investigate more closely. The western section remained sealed throughout the years, its purpose unknown even to Phineas Caldwell, Harrow's most trusted overseer, who had managed the day-to-day operations of the estate since 1848. Caldwell, a taciturn man in his 50s who had previously worked on plantations in Kentucky, was one of the few individuals who had regular access to Harrow's private office in the main house. In later testimony to county investigators, he would describe his employer as a man obsessed with documentation. Every transaction, every conversation of significance, every detail of the estate's operations was meticulously recorded in a series of leather-bound ledgers that Harrow kept locked in a massive iron safe behind his desk. But there was one set of ledgers, Caldwell noted, that was never left in the office overnight. These particular books, bound in black leather and bearing no external markings, were always removed by Harrow himself each evening and presumably taken to his private quarters. The household staff of the Harrow estate consisted of only 3 individuals, an unusually small number for such an extensive property. This deliberate understaffing was another of Harrow's eccentricities that raised quiet questions among the local community. Most estates of comparable size employed dozens of servants, yet Harrow seemed to prefer an almost monastic level of privacy. The 3 staff members, cook, housekeeper, and groundskeeper, lived in modest quarters attached to the main house, but were strictly forbidden from accessing certain areas of the building or from remaining on the property after sunset. Martha Ingram, the housekeeper, was a widow in her 40s who had been hired specifically because of her reputation for discretion and her lack of local family connections. In her careful management of Harrow's domestic affairs, she had observed patterns that disturbed her, but which she dared not question directly. Harrow's meals were often prepared for more people than were present in the house, yet she never saw additional guests arrive or depart. Bedrooms were occasionally found to show signs of recent occupancy, despite no record of visitors in the household logs. Most unsettling were the sounds she sometimes heard emanating from the basement of the main house during the late evening hours, sounds that resembled voices engaged in urgent, whispered conversation, though she could never distinguish actual words. The basement of the main house was another area that remained strictly off-limits to the household staff. Harrow maintained that the space was used solely for wine storage and document archives, but the heavy wooden door at the top of the basement stairs was secured with multiple locks, and the thick stone walls of the basement seemed designed more for containment than for mere storage. On several occasions, Martha had noticed that the door showed signs of recent use: scuff marks on the stone floor, candle wax drippings, and the lingering scent of something that reminded her unpleasantly of the tanning operations she had known in her youth. A mixture of leather and chemicals that spoke of preservation processes she preferred not to contemplate too closely. The broader community of Vermilion County had grown accustomed to Harrow's eccentricities over the years, though there remained an underlying current of unease regarding his business practices. Harrow had arrived in the county in 1847 with substantial financial resources, but no clear explanation of their source. He purchased his initial holdings from 3 separate families who were facing financial difficulties, and within 2 years had consolidated these properties into a single estate while acquiring additional acreage through what appeared to be remarkably favorable negotiations. Dr. Cornelius Whitmore, who served as the county's most prominent physician and unofficial chronicler of local society, noted in his personal correspondence that Harrow possessed an uncanny ability to identify landowners who were on the verge of financial collapse, often approaching them with purchase offers before their difficulties had become public knowledge. More disturbing was the pattern that seemed to emerge among the families who sold their properties to Harrow. Without exception, these families left the county entirely within months of their transactions, typically relocating to distant states where they had no previous connections. Dr. Whitmore's inquiries into their subsequent circumstances yielded little information, as if these families had simply vanished into the vastness of the expanding American frontier. The political dimensions of Harrow's influence extended far beyond his role as a major landowner. Through carefully cultivated relationships with county officials, state legislators, and federal land agents, he had positioned himself as an indispensable figure in the complex web of patronage and influence that governed frontier society. Judge Augustus Fairfax, who presided over the county court, was known to be a frequent dinner guest at the Harrow estate, though these visits always concluded before sunset in accordance with Harrow's peculiar preferences. Sheriff Mordecai Blackburn, despite his reputation for incorruptibility in matters of criminal justice, seemed remarkably reluctant to investigate complaints or rumors related to Harrow's business dealings. This network of influence proved particularly valuable when questions arose regarding the fate of certain individuals who had crossed Harrow in various business disputes. Between 1850 and 1854, 3 men who had challenged Harrow's land acquisitions in court simply disappeared, leaving behind no forwarding addresses and no explanations to their families or associates. The first was Jeremiah Cowan, a lawyer who had represented a family disputing Harrow's claim to a valuable tract of riverfront property. Cowan vanished in the winter of 1850, ostensibly traveling to Indianapolis on legal business, but never arrived at his stated destination. His abandoned horse and carriage were found 3 days later on a remote section of road that led away from Indianapolis rather than toward it. The second disappearance involved Marcus Drummond, a surveyor who had publicly questioned the accuracy of property boundaries in several of Harrow's acquisitions. Drummond was last seen in the autumn of 1852, leaving his boarding house in the county seat with surveying equipment and maps, reportedly conducting a private investigation into discrepancies he had discovered in official land records. His equipment was found weeks later, scattered along the banks of the Wabash River, but his body was never recovered. The official conclusion was that he had suffered an accidental drowning, though several observers noted that Drummond was an experienced outdoorsman who was unlikely to have ventured too close to the dangerous currents of the river. Most troubling was the disappearance of Reverend Gideon Morse in the spring of 1854. Morse had been serving as pastor of the Methodist congregation in the county seat and had begun asking pointed questions about the spiritual welfare of individuals who seemed to have severed all ties with the community after conducting business with Harrow. Unlike the previous disappearances, Morse's vanishing occurred under circumstances that made an accident seem impossible. He had informed multiple members of his congregation that he intended to visit the Harrow estate to discuss matters of grave spiritual concern with its owner. Several witnesses saw him riding toward the estate on the morning of March 15, 1854. He never returned, and despite extensive searching by members of his congregation, no trace of him or his horse was ever found. It was the disappearance of Reverend Morse that finally triggered a more thorough investigation into Harrow's activities, though the official inquiry would not begin for several more months. The delay was attributed to various bureaucratic complications, but many suspected that Harrow's political connections were working behind the scenes to prevent any serious scrutiny of his affairs. During this period of official inaction, however, a more informal investigation was being conducted by Silas Pemberton, a journalist from Indianapolis, who had traveled to Vermilion County to research a series of articles about frontier land speculation. Pemberton was an experienced investigator who had previously exposed corruption in land office operations in other frontier counties. His initial interest in Harrow had been sparked by reports of unusually rapid land consolidation in Vermilion County, but as he delved deeper into local records and interviewed community members, he began to uncover evidence of something far more sinister than simple fraud or political corruption. The pattern of disappearances, the secretive nature of Harrow's operations, and the fear that he observed in people who had dealt with Harrow personally all pointed toward a systematic campaign of intimidation that went far beyond normal business practices. Pemberton's investigation led him to focus particular attention on the sealed western section of Harrow's warehouse building. Through conversations with workers who had been involved in its construction, he learned that the building had been designed with unusual features that suggested it was intended for something other than conventional storage. The floor had been constructed with a slight slope toward a central drainage channel, and the walls had been lined with a special type of mortar that contained lime and ash in proportions typically used for purposes related to preservation or concealment of organic materials. Most significantly, Pemberton discovered that the building's construction had coincided with Harrow's acquisition of several parcels of land through transactions that involved unusual terms and conditions. Rather than paying the full purchase price in cash, as was his normal practice, Harrow had negotiated agreements that included ongoing obligations on the part of the sellers. These obligations were described in the legal documents only in the most general terms, referring to services to be rendered and conditions to be maintained in perpetuity. Pemberton's attempts to locate the former landowners who had agreed to these terms met with consistent failure, as all of them appeared to have relocated beyond the reach of easy communication. As Pemberton's investigation progressed through the summer of 1854, he began to experience what he later described as a systematic campaign of harassment and intimidation. His room at the local inn was searched multiple times, though nothing was taken. He received anonymous warnings advising him to abandon his inquiries and leave the county. Most disturbing were the nocturnal visits to his room, when he would awaken to find that someone had entered while he slept, rearranging his papers and personal belongings in subtle ways that served as unmistakable evidence of the intruder's presence and capabilities. These incidents convinced Pemberton that he was dealing with something far more dangerous than he had initially suspected, but they also strengthened his determination to uncover the truth. He began taking elaborate precautions to protect his research materials, creating multiple copies of important documents and distributing them to trusted associates in Indianapolis. He also started conducting his investigations primarily during daylight hours and in public locations, avoiding situations where he might be isolated or vulnerable. The breakthrough in Pemberton's investigation came from an unexpected source. In late August of 1854, he was approached by Artemus Blackwood, a former employee of Harrow's estate who had been dismissed under circumstances that remained unclear. Blackwood was a man in his 30s who had worked as a general laborer on the estate for approximately 2 years before his sudden termination in the spring of 1854. He had remained in the county after leaving Harrow's employment, supporting himself through occasional work for other local farmers, but his behavior had become increasingly erratic and paranoid since his departure from the estate. Blackwood's initial contact with Pemberton occurred during a chance encounter at a local tavern where the journalist overheard him making cryptic references to things he had seen during his time at the Harrow estate. When approached directly, Blackwood initially denied having any information of value, but Pemberton's patient cultivation of the relationship eventually yielded disturbing revelations about the true nature of Harrow's operations. According to Blackwood's account, his work responsibilities on the estate had gradually expanded to include maintenance tasks related to the sealed warehouse building. These tasks involved cleaning and basic upkeep of the eastern section of the building, which Blackwood described as being fitted out as a kind of office or meeting space, with several chairs arranged around a large table and walls lined with maps showing property boundaries throughout the county and beyond. More troubling were Blackwood's observations regarding the building's nocturnal use. During his tenure at the estate, Blackwood had been required to remain on the property overnight approximately once per month to provide security during what Harrow described as business meetings of a confidential nature. These meetings typically began after midnight and continued until shortly before dawn. Blackwood's role was limited to patrolling the perimeter of the estate to ensure that no unauthorized individuals approached the property, but this responsibility had given him opportunities to observe the comings and goings of Harrow's nocturnal visitors. The visitors, according to Blackwood, never arrived in groups or used the main road leading to the estate. Instead, they approached individually along forest paths that converged on the warehouse building from multiple directions. Blackwood estimated that these gatherings typically involved between 8 and 12 participants. Though he was never able to identify any of them clearly due to the darkness and the care they took to avoid detection, what struck him as most unusual was the apparent age and physical condition of many of the visitors. Despite the demanding nature of the terrain they had to traverse to reach the warehouse, several of them appeared to be quite elderly, and at least 2 seemed to require walking sticks or other assistance to navigate the forest paths. The meetings themselves were conducted in complete secrecy within the eastern section of the warehouse, but Blackwood had occasionally heard fragments of conversation when his patrol route took him past the building. The discussions appeared to focus on property transactions, legal matters, and what sounded like negotiations regarding territorial boundaries and resource rights. More disturbing were the references he heard to individuals by name, including several people who were known to have disappeared from the county in recent years. These references suggested that the fate of the missing individuals was known to the meeting participants, though Blackwood could not determine the specific nature of their involvement. Most chilling was Blackwood's account of his final night of employment at the estate. On this occasion, which occurred in early March of 1854, the usual pattern of the nocturnal meetings had been disrupted by what appeared to be a dispute among the participants. Blackwood heard raised voices coming from the warehouse, and at one point the conversation became loud enough for him to distinguish several complete sentences. The discussion appeared to center on someone who was described as having broken the arrangement, and who represented a threat to the entire enterprise. There were references to permanent solutions and eliminating loose ends that left no doubt about the violent intentions of the speakers. The dispute was apparently resolved during the course of the meeting, but Blackwood noticed that when the participants departed in the early morning hours, one fewer individuals left than had arrived. When he mentioned this discrepancy to Harrow the following day, his employer's reaction was swift and decisive. Blackwood was immediately dismissed from his position, given a substantial sum of money, and advised in unmistakable terms that his continued health and safety depended on his absolute silence regarding anything he had seen or heard during his employment. Blackwood's revelations provided Pemberton with the first concrete evidence that Harrow was involved in criminal activity of a serious nature, but they also placed the journalist in a precarious position. The testimony of a dismissed employee with obvious personal grievances against his former employer would carry limited weight with official investigators, particularly given Harrow's political connections. More importantly, Blackwood's account made clear that Pemberton was investigating individuals who had demonstrated their willingness to use violence against those who threatened their interests. Despite these risks, Pemberton decided to pursue his investigation further, focusing his efforts on documenting the connection between Harrow's land acquisitions and the subsequent disappearances of individuals who had challenged his claims. Through careful examination of county records, he was able to establish a timeline that showed a clear correlation between property disputes and the vanishing of key witnesses or opponents. In every case, the disappearances had occurred during periods when the disputed properties were in the process of changing hands, and in every case, the resolution of the legal questions had favored Harrow's claims. More significantly, Pemberton discovered that several of the properties acquired by Harrow contained unusual deed restrictions that had been inserted into the legal documents after the original sales contracts had been executed. These restrictions typically involved limitations on future development or sale of the properties, phrased in language that was sufficiently vague to be legally meaningless but specific enough to suggest that the restrictions served some practical purpose, known only to the parties involved. A detailed examination of these deed restrictions revealed a pattern that suggested they were designed to ensure long-term control over specific geographic areas rather than individual properties. The restricted parcels formed a rough circle around the Harrow estate, creating what amounted to a buffer zone of properties that could not be developed or sold without satisfying conditions that were deliberately undefined. This geographic arrangement suggested that Harrow's land acquisition strategy was designed to serve purposes that went beyond simple financial investment or agricultural development. As Pemberton's investigation continued into the autumn of 1854, he began to experience increasingly direct attempts at intimidation. His correspondence with editors in Indianapolis was intercepted and delayed. His movements around the county were monitored by individuals who made no effort to conceal their surveillance. Most disturbing were the nighttime incidents at his lodgings, which escalated from simple harassment to clear threats against his personal safety. The crisis point came in early November when Pemberton returned to his room after a day of research to find that his belongings had been thoroughly searched and his notes reorganized in a way that demonstrated intimate knowledge of his investigation. Placed prominently on his desk was a map of the county with his own name written across the location of his lodgings, surrounded by the names of other individuals who had been investigating Harrow's activities. Each of these other names had been crossed out with red ink, and beside each was written a date corresponding to their disappearance. This explicit threat convinced Pemberton that his life was in immediate danger, but it also provided him with evidence that could potentially be used to convince law enforcement officials to take action. The map represented a direct admission of responsibility for the disappearances and could serve as a foundation for criminal charges if it could be properly authenticated. Pemberton's problem was that his investigation had made clear that several local officials were likely complicit in Harrow's activities, making it impossible to know which authorities could be trusted with such sensitive evidence. The solution to this dilemma came through Pemberton's contacts in Indianapolis, where he had maintained relationships with federal law enforcement officials who operated independently of local political networks. Through careful negotiation, he was able to arrange for a federal investigation into Harrow's activities, focusing on potential violations of federal land laws rather than the more speculative charges related to the disappearances. This approach offered the advantage of bringing outside investigators into the county while providing a legal framework that would be difficult for Harrow's local allies to obstruct. The federal investigation officially began in December of 1854, led by Deputy Marshal Harrison Crenshaw, a veteran law enforcement officer with extensive experience in frontier corruption cases. Crenshaw's initial approach was deliberately low-key, focusing on routine audits of land office records and interviews with county officials regarding standard administrative procedures. This strategy was designed to avoid alerting Harrow to the true scope of the investigation while gathering evidence that could support more serious charges. However, Crenshaw's careful approach was undermined by the interconnected nature of Harrow's influence network. Within days of the investigation's commencement, Harrow was clearly aware that federal authorities were scrutinizing his activities. Rather than attempting to obstruct the investigation directly, he adopted a strategy of full cooperation with the authorities, while simultaneously taking steps to eliminate any evidence that might support criminal charges. The most dramatic manifestation of this strategy occurred in the early morning hours of December 18, 1854. Residents of the county seat reported seeing an unusual orange glow on the horizon in the direction of the Harrow estate, accompanied by clouds of smoke that suggested a major fire. By dawn, it became clear that the mysterious warehouse building had been completely destroyed, along with whatever evidence it might have contained regarding Harrow's nocturnal activities. When Deputy Marshal Crenshaw and his team arrived at the estate later that morning, they found Harrow calmly supervising efforts to prevent the fire from spreading to other buildings. Harrow's explanation for the blaze was straightforward. The building had been struck by lightning during a brief thunderstorm the previous evening, and the resulting fire had consumed the structure before anyone could organize effective firefighting efforts. The explanation was plausible enough to be legally acceptable, particularly since no witnesses had observed anything that contradicted Harrow's account. However, several aspects of the fire scene raised questions that Crenshaw noted in his official report. The destruction of the building had been remarkably complete, with virtually nothing remaining except foundations and scattered debris. More significantly, the debris showed signs of having been deliberately arranged to facilitate complete combustion and chemical residues found in the ashes suggested the use of accelerants that would not typically be present in a building used for conventional storage purposes. Most troubling was the discovery of bone fragments scattered throughout the ash, some of which appeared to be human in origin. When questioned about these findings, Harrow expressed surprise and suggested that the fragments might have originated from animal remains that had been stored in the building for disposal. However, the quantity and distribution of the bone fragments suggested a much more systematic deposition of organic material than would be consistent with routine disposal of animal carcasses. Despite these disturbing findings, Crenshaw faced significant challenges in building a criminal case against Harrow. The destruction of the warehouse had eliminated what appeared to be the primary site of any illegal activities, and potential witnesses had either disappeared or were clearly too intimidated to provide truthful testimony. More importantly, the jurisdiction issues between federal and local authorities created bureaucratic obstacles that Harrow's legal advisors proved adept at exploiting. The investigation took a new direction when Crenshaw decided to focus on the financial aspects of Harrow's operations rather than trying to prove specific criminal acts. Through coordination with federal banking authorities, he was able to trace the sources of Harrow's wealth and identify patterns of financial activity that suggested involvement in illegal enterprises. This approach yielded evidence of connections to criminal organizations operating in multiple states, including groups involved in land fraud, illegal trafficking, and various forms of extortion. Most significantly, Crenshaw discovered that Harrow had been receiving regular payments from sources that could not be legitimately identified, and that these payments corresponded to periods when individuals with potential claims against Harrow's property acquisitions had disappeared or withdrawn their challenges. This financial evidence provided a foundation for federal charges that did not require direct proof of violent crimes, but could still result in serious penalties, including forfeiture of Harrow's properties. However, before these charges could be formally filed, the investigation was disrupted by another disappearance. In late January of 1855, Silas Pemberton, the journalist whose research had initiated the federal investigation, failed to arrive for a scheduled meeting with Deputy Marshal Crenshaw. A search of his lodgings revealed that his belongings remained undisturbed, but Pemberton himself had vanished as completely as the other individuals who had crossed paths with Harrow's organization. This latest disappearance convinced federal authorities that they were dealing with an extremely dangerous criminal enterprise, but it also demonstrated the limitations of conventional law enforcement approaches. The pattern of intimidation and elimination of witnesses had created an atmosphere of fear that made further investigation increasingly difficult, and the political connections that protected Harrow's organization extended well beyond the local level. The final resolution of the Harrow case came through an unexpected development that occurred in February of 1855. Artemus Blackwood, the former estate employee whose testimony had provided crucial insights into Harrow's operations, approached Deputy Marshal Crenshaw with an offer to provide additional evidence in exchange for federal protection. Blackwood revealed that his initial account of his experiences at the estate had omitted certain crucial details that he had been afraid to disclose previously. According to Blackwood's expanded testimony, his work at the estate had included maintenance responsibilities related to the basement of the main house as well as the warehouse building. These responsibilities had given him access to areas that contained evidence of activities far more serious than land fraud or simple intimidation. The basement, Blackwood claimed, had been fitted out as a kind of workshop, where various forms of chemical and biological processing took place, processes that generated the distinctive odors that had been noted by other observers. More specifically, Blackwood described finding equipment and materials that suggested involvement in the preparation and preservation of organic materials for purposes that he could only speculate about. There were large metal containers filled with chemical solutions, mechanical devices for grinding and processing various substances, and storage areas that contained items which Blackwood preferred not to describe in detail. Most disturbing were the personal effects that he had found mixed among these materials, items that appeared to have belonged to individuals who had disappeared from the county in recent years. Blackwood's revelations provided federal investigators with sufficient evidence to obtain warrants for a comprehensive search of the Harrow estate. However, when Deputy Marshal Crenshaw and his team arrived to execute these warrants on March 3, 1855, they found the main house deserted and most of its contents removed. Harrow had clearly been warned of the impending search and had used the time to eliminate any remaining evidence of his activities. The search of the abandoned estate, nevertheless, yielded important discoveries that confirmed the worst suspicions about Harrow's operations. The basement of the main house, despite obvious efforts to clean it thoroughly, still contained chemical residues and organic materials that suggested its use for purposes related to the disposal of human remains. More significantly, the investigators found a concealed chamber beneath the basement floor that contained documents and personal effects belonging to several of the individuals who had disappeared over the past several years. Among these materials was a partial journal that appeared to have been written by Reverend Gideon Morse during what were clearly the final days of his life. The entries described his growing awareness that he had uncovered evidence of a criminal conspiracy that extended far beyond simple land fraud. According to Morse's account, Harrow's organization was involved in systematic elimination of individuals who posed threats to an extensive network of illegal enterprises, and the missing persons from Vermilion County represented only a small fraction of the organization's victims. Most chilling was Morse's description of his final meeting with Harrow, during which the landowner had calmly explained the practical necessity of eliminating witnesses and the efficient methods that his organization had developed for this purpose. The entries suggested that Morse had been kept prisoner in the concealed basement chamber for several days before his eventual death, during which time he had been forced to witness activities that confirmed his worst fears about the nature of Harrow's operations. The discovery of this evidence provided federal authorities with a foundation for murder charges, but it also revealed the full scope of the challenge they faced in prosecuting the case. Harrow's disappearance had clearly been carefully planned, and his financial resources and political connections provided him with numerous options for avoiding capture. More troubling was the evidence that his organization extended well beyond Vermilion County, with associates and operations in multiple states that could provide ongoing support for his fugitive status. The federal investigation continued for several more months, but it gradually became clear that Harrow had successfully evaded justice. Reports of his presence came from various locations throughout the Midwest and beyond, but none of these sightings could be confirmed and none led to his apprehension. By the end of 1855, the active investigation was suspended, though federal authorities maintained that the case remained open and that efforts to locate Harrow would continue. During the extended investigation period, additional disturbing details emerged about the scope and nature of Harrow's criminal enterprise. Through examination of the concealed basement chamber and analysis of documents found there, investigators pieced together evidence of a systematic operation that had been functioning for several years before its exposure. The operation appeared to involve not only the elimination of individuals who threatened Harrow's land acquisitions, but also a broader network of criminal activities that extended across multiple territories and involved numerous accomplices. One of the most disturbing discoveries was a detailed ledger that documented transactions involving human trafficking and forced labor arrangements. The entries in this ledger suggested that Harrow's organization had been involved in the systematic exploitation of vulnerable individuals, including recent immigrants. displaced persons, and individuals who had found themselves in desperate financial circumstances. These victims appeared to have been lured to the estate under false pretenses and then subjected to conditions that amounted to slavery or indentured servitude. The ledger indicated that many of these individuals had eventually been eliminated when they became liabilities to the organization, either because they attempted to escape or because they possessed information that could compromise the operation. The efficient and systematic nature of these eliminations suggested that Harrow's organization had developed sophisticated methods for disposing of human remains, methods that explained why so few traces of missing persons had ever been discovered by local authorities. Even more chilling was evidence that the organization had been experimenting with various chemical and biological techniques for disposing of human remains and eliminating evidence of their crimes. The basement workshop contained remnants of equipment that appeared to be designed for dissolving organic materials, and chemical residues found throughout the basement suggested the use of powerful acids and other substances that could completely eliminate physical evidence of violent crimes. This evidence explained many of the mysterious aspects of the disappearances that had plagued Vermilion County for several years. The complete absence of physical remains, the lack of witnesses to violent crimes, and the difficulty in establishing clear evidence of foul play had all resulted from the sophisticated methods that Harrow's organization had developed for concealing their activities. The operation represented a level of criminal sophistication that was unprecedented in frontier territories and demonstrated the potential for organized crime to exploit the limited law enforcement capabilities of frontier communities. As federal investigators delved deeper into the financial records of the organization, they uncovered evidence of connections to criminal networks operating throughout the expanding American frontier. Harrow's operation appeared to be part of a larger consortium of criminal enterprises that coordinated their activities across territorial and state boundaries, sharing resources, intelligence, and specialized expertise. This discovery suggested that the problem of organized crime in frontier territories was far more extensive and systematic than law enforcement officials had previously recognized. The financial analysis revealed that Harrow's organization had been receiving funding and support from criminal networks operating in major urban centers, including Chicago, St. Louis, and New Orleans. These connections provided the organization with access to sophisticated equipment, specialized knowledge, and political influence that enabled them to operate with relative impunity in isolated frontier communities. The evidence suggested that Harrow's operation served as a kind of testing ground for criminal techniques that were later implemented in other locations. Perhaps most disturbing was the discovery that the organization had been systematically corrupting local officials and institutions throughout the territories where they operated. The investigation revealed evidence of bribery, intimidation, and other forms of corruption that had compromised the integrity of law enforcement, judicial, and political institutions in multiple counties and territories. This corruption had created an environment where criminal organizations could operate with virtual impunity, knowing that local officials would either ignore their activities or actively assist in concealing evidence of their crimes. The scope of this corruption explained why it had taken so long for Harrow's activities to attract serious investigative attention, and why the eventual federal investigation had encountered so many obstacles and delays. The organization had effectively captured the local governance structures that should have provided protection for community members, turning these institutions into tools for facilitating and concealing criminal activities. As news of these discoveries spread throughout the region, communities in multiple territories began re-examining suspicious disappearances and unexplained events that had occurred in their areas. Several other federal investigations were initiated based on evidence suggesting that similar criminal organizations might be operating in other frontier territories. These investigations revealed that the Harrow case represented only one example of a much larger pattern of organized criminal activity that was exploiting the vulnerabilities of frontier society. The broader investigation efforts revealed evidence of at least 3 other criminal organizations operating according to similar principles in territories across the Midwest and Great Plains. These organizations shared common characteristics including systematic corruption of local officials, sophisticated methods for eliminating evidence and witnesses, and financial connections to urban criminal networks. The discovery of these connections demonstrated that organized crime had adapted more quickly to frontier conditions than law enforcement agencies had recognized, and that conventional approaches to criminal investigation were inadequate for addressing this emerging threat. One particularly disturbing aspect of these broader investigations was the discovery that criminal organizations had been deliberately targeting frontier communities that were geographically isolated and possessed limited communication links to outside authorities. This targeting strategy allowed the organizations to operate for extended periods without detection, while gradually infiltrating and corrupting local institutions to create environments that were conducive to their criminal activities. The investigation also revealed that these organizations had been systematically exploiting the legal and jurisdictional complexities that characterized frontier territories. The unclear boundaries between territorial, state, and federal authority, combined with limited communication and coordination between different law enforcement agencies, created opportunities for sophisticated criminals to evade prosecution by moving between jurisdictions and exploiting bureaucratic gaps in the legal system. The Harrow case thus served as a catalyst for significant reforms in federal law enforcement approaches to frontier crime. The Department of Justice began developing specialized units with territorial jurisdiction and enhanced coordination capabilities, designed specifically to address organized criminal activities that crossed traditional jurisdictional boundaries. These reforms included the establishment of better communication networks between federal agents operating in different territories, standardized procedures for investigating complex criminal organizations, and enhanced training for federal law enforcement personnel assigned to frontier territories. However, these reforms came too late to provide justice for the many victims of Harrow's organization or to prevent the psychological and social damage that their activities had inflicted on the communities where they operated. The investigation had revealed evidence suggesting that dozens of individuals had been victimized by the organization over the course of several years, and that many of these crimes would never be fully documented due to the sophisticated methods used to eliminate evidence and witnesses. The long-term impact of the Harrow case on Vermilion County and surrounding communities was profound and lasting. The revelation that such systematic evil had been operating in their midst for years created a crisis of trust that affected relationships between community members for decades afterward. Many residents who had been aware of suspicious activities but had remained silent out of fear found themselves struggling with guilt and self-recrimination, while others who had unknowingly facilitated the organization's activities through routine business or social interactions questioned their own judgment and perceptions. The case also had significant economic consequences for the region. The notoriety associated with the Harrow estate and the revelations about organized criminal activity deterred potential settlers and investors, slowing the economic development of the county for several years. Property values throughout the region declined as news of the case spread, and several businesses that had depended on growth and development were forced to close or relocate to other territories. Perhaps most tragically, the case demonstrated the vulnerability of frontier communities to exploitation by sophisticated criminal organizations and highlighted the inadequacy of existing institutional protections for isolated populations. The systematic corruption of local officials and the intimidation of potential witnesses had created an environment where criminal activities could persist for years without effective challenge, despite the presence of numerous community members who suspected that something was seriously wrong. The psychological impact on survivors and witnesses was particularly severe. Several individuals who had provided testimony during the federal investigation required ongoing medical treatment for what contemporary physicians described as nervous disorders, characterized by persistent anxiety, insomnia, and an inability to feel safe in familiar environments. Some of these individuals eventually relocated to distant communities where they hoped to escape the memories and associations connected to their experiences with Harrow's organization. The case also had lasting effects on law enforcement practices throughout frontier territories. The recognition that organized criminal networks were operating in frontier communities led to enhanced cooperation between federal, territorial, and local law enforcement agencies, and to the development of new investigative techniques specifically designed to address the challenges posed by sophisticated criminal organizations. These developments represented significant advances in American law enforcement capabilities, though they came at the cost of numerous innocent lives and the destruction of community trust in multiple frontier settlements. Educational institutions and religious organizations also responded to the case by developing new programs designed to help communities recognize and resist criminal infiltration. These programs emphasized the importance of maintaining open communication channels between community members and outside authorities, and provided training for local leaders on how to identify and report suspicious activities that might indicate the presence of organized criminal operations. The federal government's response to the case included significant legislative reforms designed to strengthen law enforcement capabilities in frontier territories and to close the jurisdictional gaps that criminal organizations had been exploiting. These reforms included the establishment of territorial marshals with enhanced authority and resources, improved communication systems for coordinating investigations across territorial boundaries, and standardized procedures for handling complex criminal cases that involved multiple jurisdictions. However, the most significant long-term consequence of the Harrow case may have been its impact on public awareness of the potential for organized criminal activity in frontier communities. The case served as a wake-up call for both law enforcement officials and community leaders about the sophisticated and systematic nature of the threats facing frontier settlements and contributed to the development of more effective strategies for preventing and addressing such threats in the future. The legacy of Elias Harrow and his criminal organization thus extends far beyond the specific crimes committed in Vermilion County during the 1850s. The case represented a turning point in American understanding of frontier crime and led to significant improvements in law enforcement capabilities and institutional protections for frontier communities. However, these improvements came at a tremendous cost in human suffering and community trauma that affected the lives of hundreds of individuals for decades after Harrow's disappearance. Today, more than a century and a half after the events in Vermilion County, the Harrow case continues to serve as a reminder of the importance of maintaining vigilance against sophisticated criminal threats and ensuring that institutional protections for vulnerable populations remain strong and effective. The case demonstrates that evil can flourish in any environment where oversight is limited and where criminal organizations possess sufficient resources and sophistication to corrupt or intimidate the institutions that should provide protection for community members. The ultimate fate of Elias Harrow himself remains one of the great unsolved mysteries of American frontier history. Despite extensive federal investigations and numerous reported sightings over the years, he was never apprehended or definitively located. Some investigators theorized that he was killed by rival criminal organizations or by associates who viewed him as a liability, while others believed that he successfully established a new identity in a remote location where his criminal history was unknown. Perhaps the most disturbing possibility, however, is that Harrow simply moved his operations to a new frontier territory where law enforcement presence was even more limited, and where potential victims would be even more isolated and vulnerable. The techniques and organizational methods that he had developed in Vermilion County could easily be adapted to other frontier settings, and his demonstrated ability to corrupt local officials and intimidate potential witnesses suggested that he possessed the skills necessary to establish similar criminal enterprises in multiple locations. This possibility is supported by reports of similar criminal activities in other frontier territories during the years following Harrow's disappearance from Vermilion County. Several cases involving systematic intimidation, mysterious disappearances, and sophisticated methods for eliminating evidence bear striking resemblances to the pattern of activities documented in the Harrow case. However, the limited communication and coordination capabilities of frontier law enforcement agencies made it impossible to establish definitive connections between these cases and Harrow's organization. The enduring mystery of Harrow's fate serves as a fitting conclusion to a case that demonstrated both the vulnerability of frontier communities to sophisticated criminal exploitation and the limitations of contemporary law enforcement approaches to addressing such threats. While the federal investigation succeeded in exposing the scope and nature of Harrow's criminal organization and led to significant reforms in law enforcement practices, the failure to apprehend the principal perpetrator left a sense of incomplete justice that continues to resonate with students of frontier crime history. The Harrow case ultimately serves as both a historical curiosity and a continuing cautionary tale about the potential for systematic evil to flourish in environments where institutional oversight is limited and where criminal organizations possess sufficient resources and sophistication to corrupt or circumvent existing protective mechanisms. The lessons learned from this case remain relevant today as communities continue to face threats from organized criminal activities that exploit vulnerabilities in social and institutional structures. In this sense, the story of Elias Harrow transcends its specific historical context and provides insights into the ongoing challenges of maintaining justice and protecting vulnerable populations in any society. The case reminds us that vigilance and strong institutions are essential safeguards against the kind of systematic exploitation that characterized Harrow's criminal enterprise, and that the price of failing to maintain these safeguards can be measured in human lives and community trauma that persists for generations.